Don.
I just want to maybe ask Paul to elaborate a bit on this thing. It sounds almost like a tautology that we want to have better science formulate public policy. Think about the healthcare debate and the issues about whether or not you can require that people with pre-existing conditions be covered without at the same time increasing, having some sort of mandate that people provide insurance. There's an argument, there's an analysis there of adverse selection that is well understood in a lot of different arguments, and that's central. Understanding that is central to formulating intelligent policy about it. So I understand why we don't, obviously it's incorrect to think that getting the science right gives us great policy, or there's an automatic translation there. But surely it's better to have a better understanding of the dynamics of the system in which you are intervening through some kind of public policy in order to be able to formulate policy that's going to achieve the goals you want to achieve.
Yeah, no, I certainly didn't mean to imply that science is useless in the setting of public policy.
Well, so how do we understand the uses that it has, I guess?
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's actually something that, I've been trying to figure out for a very long time. I mean, because, so for example, during the Cold War, lots of studies were done on things like, bomber site basing and things like that. And the military actually used very few of the results that they were given from operations research and things like that. And one of the puzzles I've been wondering about for a very long time is why on earth did they do them then? And it really isn't clear to me. I think you have to understand it as part of a division of labor inside a policy-making process, where people produce things that are then of political use to other people. But there's a larger sociological theory of that I haven't quite fully grasped yet. But that was an open question that I actually sort of wanted to raise.
Well, I mentioned because it bears on Joe's point about one of the sort of ideals about public life and the idea of a democratic society is that we should be able, through our political action, to consciously, deliberately shape the parameters of the world in which we live so that the results of our own action don't operate as external forces that control us and dominate our existence. So this view, which is the way of thinking of how we should think about the political problem, really depends upon a certain kind of rational understanding and the ability to harness that rational understanding into political discourse that's aimed at creating some kind of consensus in policy. And I think there's some level of skepticism about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the history of the Kyoto Protocol and the climate change debate should give one cause for skepticism. I mean, I think it's a debate actually where the evidence of global warming is not.
Yes.
I'm interested in what you said about the military doing all this advanced work and then not using the reports. And at the same time, Gary says the military is one of the groups right now that is looking at what's going on, the possibilities of climate change with a certain degree of alarm. Mm-hmm. And I wonder, do you hear that from other countries too? Our country is not the most vulnerable to being affected, but there are other countries where climate change might be causing more national security alarm. Is this likely to move us sort of for the wrong reason in a good direction?
I don't know if it's the wrong reason. I know a couple of people in the U.S. security community that will talk to me. I don't know anybody in any foreign country security community that will talk to me. So I'm not quite sure what they're up to. What the U.S. is doing is, and I don't know if it's they're not all that worked up about lots and lots of reports that generals write about climate change and stuff like that. What they want are reports that will help them frame the next generation of response and war games that they put their commanders and their officers through. And so, in those games, the deal is that sort of everybody comes in with a half an hour worth of plans of what's going to happen. And after about 5 minutes, all hell breaks loose and all of the plans go out the window. And what they want from climate guys is not implausible scenarios of what all hell breaking loose might look like, so that they can exercise the war games and see how people will respond to those. And then they've got guys that sit in the back, and maybe these are the guys that write the reports that nobody reads. They try to keep track of that. Before we get too far, I've written this down 3 times, and everybody keeps using. Don used consensus, and I just want to say that consensus in where I come from, in IPCC and in the climate science world, is an adjective that applies to the Summary for Policymaker document. And it's an international negotiation definition of consensus, which means everybody in the room has signed on to it and therefore cannot go back on that word as they move forward in negotiations. So when they agreed to the 20 pages word for word in the Summary for Policymakers unanimously, they in Valencia in 2007, they agreed that that part of the science to which they had reached consensus as negotiators would not be questioned as they moved forward to Bali and Copenhagen. Consensus as an adjective should not be applied to the science. And that's the point of all of this excruciating confidence language in the IPCC and likelihood language in the IPCC, and they're different. The confidence language says that we've got this literature out there, and a lot of it says X, and some of it says not X. We've assessed it or whatever. We're not going to say which one is right, but given what we see in the conversation we have, we bring in some experts who have written on it, including Christie and folks like that, and make a statement that it's we have medium confidence. It's more likely than not. We have high confidence. It seems like if you flipped a coin twice, you would have 3 out of 4 chances of not getting all heads. It's sort of a 3 and 4 sort of thing. Very high confidence means it's sort of like 90%. So, the thing that you picked out about is it anthropogenic forcing that's causing that? Those graphs that we both put up are the basis of a very high confidence statement in the IPCC, which means that notwithstanding that bifurcation, it's model-based disagreement that include Christie and folks like that, there's sort of an innate feeling that there's 10-15% chance that the data and the methods haven't yet given us enough information to make that statement. But the assessment is that there's 80 or 90% chance that we're right about that. Likelihood, if you heaven forbid you should go and sit and read these things, but if you see a likelihood statement, it's actually a statement that says on the basis of published literature or meta-analyses, you can actually infer statistically based probability estimates. So 99%, very likely means 90% or 90% confidence. Virtually certain means 95% confidence. That sort of thing. So it has a real statistical meaning to it. But this adjective consensus just gets bandied around, and Andy Revkin misuses it. Also, there is no consensus science. The closest it comes is that warming in the climate system is unequivocal, and that's because those 99% confidence intervals get so far apart that the likelihood that it happened by accident is sort of 1 chance in 10 million.
Well, Brian.
I'm really glad that a lot of the conversation was focused on risk, because certainty is out of the question here, and will be for the foreseeable future, as St. Philip's too late. But I'm puzzled about something, and this is maybe changing the subject a little bit, but if you could respond to this, I'd be grateful.
the focus of this session is naturally on climate change, and that's, I think, the big focus in the public policy realm right now. But there are other risks that are severe. If one is skeptical about global climate change, one might not be as skeptical about ocean acidification or about soil depletion and erosion or about water stress or about any one of a number of other things, including maybe our inability to expand debt in the future and what that means for global industrial civilization. And so why the absolute fixation on one aspect of the human footprint on the planet, and possibly one that is most contested?
For me, because that's the one I know more about than any of the but I mean, there is the notion that this stuff happens inside a world where there's multiple stresses, and there are conclusions that say the vulnerability of a system to multiple stresses is greater than the sum of the individual vulnerabilities to each one of those stress, because they amplify themselves. There's resource constraints, things like that. But I think your observation is the germ of the reason why there are 5 reasons of concern, not 2. The two reasons of concern are aggregate economics and distributed economic effects. The other 3, include risks of extreme events and what that means. Unique and threatened systems, which now includes human systems, abrupt climate change, and the manifestations of those are however they show up. And one of the things that Roger Pielke Jr. gets all worked up about is the statement that the risk from hurricanes is going up, and that's associated with climate change. He and I have talked about this, and he doesn't get it that when we talk about risk, it's probability times consequence, and the 4th assessment report doesn't say that hurricanes are more likely than they were in the 3rd assessment report. It's his work that says that the consequences of the hurricanes is bigger than we thought it was because of stupid human development practices along the coastline. Okay. It's still something we need to worry about, and we don't need changes in the relative likelihood of hurricanes to say that storm surges with a little bit of sea level rise manifests itself into increases in the frequency of disastrous flooding for coastal cities, and it doesn't take a lot. The 100-year storm in New York City will become the 20-year storm with 1.5 feet of sea level rise. So that means the 38 hurricanes shows up every other decade. Mayor Bloomberg doesn't think that's a good future to have to worry about terribly much, but he is. And he's trying to think about how we can come up in these economic times with billions of dollars of investment to start thinking about adaptation and protection of infrastructure, human infrastructure as well, not just the streets and the wires for Verizon, but the hospitals and the subway systems and stuff like that. And there, it's just, I would think people that are concerned about the causality with respect to the anthropogenic forcing and therefore skeptical of the need to do a lot of mitigation would nonetheless say there's a climate variability problem here that's exacerbated by predictable climate change according to the trends, and we should take that into account as we make adaptation plans and investment plans over the long term.
I wonder too if it isn't just a matter of terminology, because years ago people talked about global warming, then they talk about climate change, so we aren't just worrying about warming, we're worrying about climate change, and many people now think we should be talking about global change. And climate is the connecting part, because if the carbon isn't in the atmosphere, it's going in the ocean. When the ocean gets warmer, it's going out of the ocean. When you change the climate, you're changing the precipitation, you're changing the production, you're changing the soil. So it is, I think, a really nice way to connect all of these parts of our very large footprint.
One last comment.
I was very glad to hear Gary say that this letter is circulating and that the National Academy of Science is going to make some reports on this. But Joe raised the question of politics. I've followed the various efforts to get a climate change bill through Congress. And I've just been in Washington on the same subject. And the Climategate is being used to accelerate the efforts to push back any legislation that is helping the climate issue. For instance, the Murkowski bill, I couldn't believe it, is picking up votes every day, co-sponsors every day. And that's the bill Senator Murkowski, daughter of the other Murkowski, who was in Washington for a long time, has offered to stop EPA's efforts to regulate clean air and greenhouse gas. It's picking up votes. The similar legislation in the House is picking up votes. And there is a real fear that even if that they may succeed in getting their bills out. Now, the president probably would veto them, but it's an indication of how public opinion, as reflected in our Congress people, it has changed. And here in Connecticut today, I don't know what happened tonight, but there is the Connecticut Business and Industry Association, CBIA, which of course is seizing on this jobs crisis to say, well, let's prevent the Department of Environmental Protection from regulating clean water or upgrading their standards, monitoring the standards for clean water and clean air. And I don't know what those things got through.
Cajun, they should know they could just hire more people to enforce and check out the rules they have.
Well, of course,
lots of jobs.
Yes. I'm sorry, go up there and go today. Anyhow, anything you can do to not wait for these NAS reports, it's right now in the next 2 months that we've got to.
Well, some of those reports are going to be coming out in the end of April. The adaptation and limiting one, and well, couple of things. One, the Murkowski thing goes after EPA's regulatory authority for greenhouse gases, and that I think in an earlier time was brought up by the administration as, see here, if you don't take a climate bill seriously, we'll get the EPA to do it, and it's a really bad way of doing it. And it turns out it's really expensive, and that threat seems to have turned on its head, perhaps. But it's still a very expensive way of going about doing it. So some of those votes and the sponsors that you're picking up probably are not people that are skeptical of the climate science, but just think this is a really terrible way of going about regulating greenhouse gas emissions. I don't know. I mean, I think that they probably think that it's better than no regulation at all for 2 or 3 years. But with respect to the other type of consensus, in Washington, there are people we will never convince one way or the other. There are people that, like Senator Kerry, really thinks this is a problem. There's people like Senator Inhofe that just thinks it's all made up, and some actually, I think, fundamentally believes that scientists have around the world for 20 years conspired to do this. Most of us are completely socially inept, but somehow we managed to keep this global secret for 20 years, and it was only revealed after people broke into the email. I don't quite understand, but anyway, I think Senator Inhofe really believes that, and so you're not going to convince him. But what we were worried about is trying to, at the very least, for the people who are somewhere in between, not allow them to fall victim of the claim that these mistakes undermine the credibility of the IPCC work, but most fundamentally the major conclusions. It's like the economist said, this stuff is ripe with uncertainty, but the fundamental conclusions we think are very strong and worthy of pushing forward on climate legislation.
Well, anything you can do to get that point out in the public.
We're trying.
So, on behalf of the All Britain Center for the Study of Public Life, let me thank you all for attending and ask you to thank our three speakers.